The year is 1830, and the cold morning air bites at your cheeks as you stand in the market square of a Yorkshire town. The cobblestones beneath your worn boots are slick with frost, each breath forming a small white cloud that vanishes into the damp mist. Around you, the murmurs of a gathering crowd swell, not the excited hum of anticipation, but something stranger, heavier, an atmosphere thick with curiosity and unease. The coarse rope around your neck scratches against your skin. It is a halter, the kind used for horses or cattle, but today it binds you. The other end is held in the rough, calloused hand of your husband. His voice, already warmed by ale drunk at dawn to steady his nerves, rises over the crowd like that of a practiced auctioneer. "What am I bid for this fine woman?" The words are delivered with a grotesque mixture of bravado and desperation. The onlookers press closer, their faces shadowed with different shades of judgment, amusement, disgust, curiosity, and calculation. A butcher nudges a farmer, whispering that she looks strong enough for endless laundry. A young man smirks, assessing whether her face, worn from years of labor, still carries enough beauty to warm a bed. Another man crouches slightly, peering at her hands, searching for calluses that might prove her worth in honest work. She is inspected like a mare at an auction, her body a ledger of value. Your heart pounds so loudly you can almost hear it over the crowd. You know that in minutes your life will change irrevocably. Perhaps you will end up in the household of a kinder man, a widower in need of companionship. Perhaps you will land in an even crueler fate, sold to someone who views you as nothing more than a servant, or worse. The most terrifying truth is that none of this is unlawful. This is no crime committed in secret, no furtive bargain whispered behind closed doors. This is public, sanctioned in the rough logic of the time. For the poor and working class, this ritual was the only way to obtain what the law denied: release from a marriage. In a world where official divorce was all but impossible, wife selling became astonishingly the closest thing to freedom. The scene seems unthinkable to us now, yet in the harsh reality of early 19th century England, it carried its own twisted form of legitimacy. Wife selling was not written in law, but it was woven into custom, and for some women, it was not merely humiliation, it was hope. Before we dive deeper into these stories, pause for a moment. Consider the strangeness of this spectacle. A marketplace where livestock, grain, and fabric were bartered, now also a theater for human fates. Picture the frosted breath of cattle lingering in the same air as the desperate breath of women waiting to be auctioned. Here, commerce and survival blurred into one grotesque ceremony. This is where our story begins, not in the privacy of homes or courtrooms, but in the open air of a market square, where dignity was stripped away and replaced with the crude promise of second chances. And yet, behind the humiliation, behind the rough laughter and bargaining, there lies something profoundly human: the search for escape, for survival, for a fragment of autonomy in a system designed to deny it. This is the story of wife selling in England. To understand why a woman could be led by rope into a market square and sold like livestock, we must first step into the strange and suffocating world of English law in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. At the center of this world was the doctrine of coverture, a legal principle that transformed marriage into a kind of erasure. Sir William Blackstone, the most influential legal scholar of the 18th century, described it starkly in his 1753 commentaries on the laws of England. The very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of her husband. In other words, once a woman married, she ceased to exist as an individual under the law. She became what was called a feme covert, a covered woman, hidden beneath the shadow of her husband's identity. Consider Mary Thompson, a fictional but utterly typical working-class woman of the 1820s. Before marriage, Mary could own her wages, sign contracts, even take a dispute to court. She had, at least in theory, some thread of independence. But the moment she spoke her vows, those rights dissolved. The money she earned from washing clothes or selling bread, legally her husband's. Any inheritance from her parents, immediately his. Even her clothes, The very dress she wore at the wedding were legally his property. The law did not recognize Mary as her own person. She became an extension of her husband's body, his shadow in every legal and economic sense. And with that legal fusion came terrifying consequences. If her husband drank away their rent money, she could not intervene. If he gambled away their food, she had no recourse. If he beat her bloody, the law shrugged, for a man was entitled to correct his wife much as he might discipline a child or break in a horse. The idea was rooted not only in law, but in culture. A husband was head of the household, responsible for its order and survival, and therefore granted sweeping authority. A wife who resisted was seen as destabilizing not just the marriage, but society itself. Domestic violence, so long as it wasn't life-threatening, was largely invisible to the courts. Poverty caused by a husband's idleness or addiction was regarded as misfortune, not injustice. And what of affection? What of love? Those belonged to the privileged few. For the working classes, marriage was often less about companionship and more about economic survival. 2 incomes, or at least a wife's unpaid domestic labor, kept a family afloat. But when a husband refused to work or drank away his wages, the wife could not simply walk away. Imagine Mary Thompson once again. She stands in her tiny kitchen, her children hungry, her ribs aching from her husband's fists. She has met a widower, perhaps a decent man who offers kindness. She imagines a new life, one where she is not treated as an object but as a partner. But under the law, that dream is impossible. Marriage is a cage with no exit. The cruelty of coverture was not always visible to those who benefited from it. To Parliament and the courts, it was order. To men of property, it was protection. But to women like Mary, it was a slow suffocation, the extinguishing of her very selfhood. And when survival demanded escape, when the law denied relief, the market square became a courtroom, and the halter became a petition for freedom. Wife-selling, grotesque as it was, emerged not merely from cruelty but from this suffocating legal silence. It was a ritual that mocked the system even as it obeyed its twisted logic. If a woman was property, then why should she not be transferred as property was? And so, under the weight of coverture, the stage was set for a practice that shocked outsiders but, for those trapped within it, offered the faint light of possibility. If coverture was the legal cage, divorce was the locked door with no key. For most of England's poor and working-class families in the 18th and early 19th centuries, the very word divorce belonged to another world, a world of nobles, kings, and the wealthy elite. Before 1857, to obtain a true divorce meant petition in Parliament directly. Imagine that. Your misery, your abuse, your longing for freedom transformed into a debate among lawmakers in Westminster. And the price for this ordeal? At least £1,000, an astronomical sum when most laborers earned barely £40 in an entire year. In today's money, that's over £100,000, the equivalent of a mansion's worth of wealth. Divorce was not a legal remedy for the common people, it was a luxury for the powerful. For those with less money, nearly everyone, options were bleak. There were, in practice, 5 ways to end a marriage. 1. Separation by mutual agreement. A couple might simply stop living together, drawing up an informal arrangement, but legally they remained bound, unable to remarry. It was freedom in name only. 2. Desertion. One partner, often the husband, would vanish, leaving the other behind. But if he returned, she had no protection. And if she disappeared, she could be tracked down and dragged back to her duties. 3. A legal separation through church courts. But even here, relief was narrow. A woman had to prove adultery, incest, or life-threatening cruelty. Not just bruises, not hunger or neglect, but cruelty that could kill her. Even then, the marriage bond remained. She could not remarry. 4. Death. Grim as it sounds, widowhood was the surest path to freedom. Disease, accident, or misfortune often ended marriages sooner than the law ever could. And then, the 5th option, wife-selling. It sounds barbaric. It was. Yet, in its twisted way, it provided something closer to divorce than the courts allowed. A husband could rid himself of responsibility. A wife could move into another household and, in the eyes of her neighbors, start anew. It was not recognized in law, but it was recognized by custom, and in the lives of desperate people, custom often carried more weight than the letter of the law. This impossible landscape bred contradictions. A nobleman could pay for Parliament to dissolve his marriage, emerging free to wed again with the blessing of church and law. Meanwhile, a coal miner's wife endured starvation beside a drunk who gambled their wages, with no escape but public sale. For the rich, divorce was politics. For the poor, it was spectacle. Marriage itself, especially in the working classes, was rarely about romance. It was an economic arrangement, a pooling of resources for survival, a husband's wages, a wife's labor, and the children's future earnings. These were the pillars of family life. When one pillar collapsed, the structure threatened to fall, but the law offered no tools to rebuild. So imagine the frustration, the helplessness of thousands of Mary Thompsons across England. Beaten, starved, or abandoned, they looked to the law and saw a door bolted shut, and so they turned to the marketplace, the public square, to improvise their own form of justice. In this desperation, wife-selling was born, not as an act of cruelty alone, but as the only crack of light in a system that refused to recognize a woman's right to leave. The custom of wife-selling did not emerge out of nowhere. It grew slowly, almost organically, from the rigid soil of English law and the desperate needs of the poor. Sometime in the late 17th century, in small towns and rural markets, people began treating women as they were treated under law, as property. If cows, horses, and sheep could be sold when an arrangement no longer suited, why not a wife? This reasoning was not simply callous, it was the cruel logic of coverture taken to its extreme. If the law refused to give the poor divorce, they would invent their own. And so the ritual of wife-selling was born. The process carried its own peculiar dignity and humiliation, a grotesque parody of both divorce and remarriage. It usually began with an advertisement. Local newspapers carried announcements as if they were selling a horse. John Smith will sell his wife Mary at Doncaster Market on Tuesday next. She is healthy, strong, and of good character. No reasonable offer refused. Others were more blunt, almost comical in their bitterness. Thomas Brown, being tired of his wife, will dispose of her to any person willing to take her off his hands. On the appointed day, the ritual unfolded in public view. The husband led his wife into the marketplace, the very same place where sheep and cattle were sold. The symbolism could not have been more direct. Around her neck, or sometimes her arm or waist, was a halter, most often a rope but occasionally a ribbon, a pathetic attempt at dignity. This halter mattered. It was proof of ownership and transfer, a visible reminder to everyone watching that this was property changing hands. To modern eyes, it is shocking to see women willingly enter such humiliation. Yet many did. For them, the ritual was not just degradation, it was transformation. It was the possibility of passing from a life of misery into one with hope. If her new buyer was a man she already loved, a sweetheart, a protector, someone who could keep her and her children safe, then the halter became not only a symbol of subjugation, but of release. It was, in essence, a community-sanctioned form of divorce. By acting it out publicly, with witnesses, with ceremony, with tokens exchanged, the participants created a kind of rough legality, and the community, by gathering, by laughing, by nodding, became complicit in validating what the courts denied. The historian E.P. Thompson once wrote of the English working class that they created customs in defiance of law. Wife-selling was precisely that. It mocked the authority of judges and Parliament, while at the same time imitating their rituals. A rope instead of a legal writ. A marketplace instead of Westminster Hall. A crowd of farmers instead of robed lawyers. Behind the humiliation, there was method. The husband rid himself of responsibility. The wife, if fortune favored her, stepped into a new household, and the crowd bore witness, ensuring that no one could later deny the bargain had been struck. This was not law, but in villages and towns where the law turned its face away, it was close enough. A wife's sale was rarely spontaneous. It followed a choreography that everyone in the community seemed to know, a grotesque play acted out in the heart of the market square. The husband, often fortified with ale to steady his nerves, would stand before the gathered crowd. Beside him, his wife, rope halter around her neck, arm, or waist, the symbol of ownership made flesh. Sometimes she stood with lowered eyes, resigned. Sometimes her chin was lifted high, daring anyone to laugh at her suffering. The ritual began with the husband's announcement. His words echoed those of a livestock auctioneer. "What am I offered for this fine woman? She's 26 years old, can bear children, excellent at needlework, and has all her teeth." The absurdity of the phrasing struck no one as strange. This was how value was described in a world where women were treated as property. The crowd pressed closer. Men examined her hands for calluses that proved she could labor. They judged her face for beauty, her hips for childbearing. Some asked her to speak, testing her manners and tone of voice. The line between performance and humiliation blurred until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. And yet, beneath the performance, there was often a hidden script. Many of these sales were not truly auctions at all. The buyer was frequently the woman's lover, a man she had already chosen, and the sale was a carefully staged ritual meant to make their union appear legitimate. Without it, they would live in scandal, accused of adultery. With it, they had the blessing, if not of the courts, then of their neighbors. Take the case of Brighton in 1826, which later inspired Thomas Hardy's The Mayor of Casterbridge. A man led his tidy-looking woman into the market and sold her to a sailor for £5. The newspapers reported that she seemed nothing loath to go, and that all parties conducted the affair in good humor. The sailor had likely courted her for months, and the sale was their only chance to begin a new life together. Or consider Lock Market in 1830, where a woman was sold for 2 shillings and 6pence. When her husband hesitated, perhaps regretting the spectacle, she snapped at him with fierce resolve. "Let be, you rogue. I will be sold. I want a change." Her voice, carried across nearly 2 centuries, is not one of submission, but of defiance. She was demanding the only freedom available to her. The money exchanged in these sales varied wildly. Some women were sold for as much as £100, an immense sum, over £18,000 in today's terms. Others went for a few shillings, or even a glass of ale. But money was never the true point. What mattered was the crowd, the witnesses, the ritual. The halter, when passed from husband to buyer, became proof that the transaction was real, that it had been seen, acknowledged, and could not easily be undone. These were not secret acts of desperation. They were public ceremonies, performed before dozens, sometimes hundreds of neighbors. They carried shame, yes, but also a twisted kind of dignity. To be sold was to endure ridicule. But to endure it meant transformation, from wife to ex-wife, from property of one man to the property of another. And in that transformation, some women found the only doorway to survival the law would ever allow them. Not all wife sales were crude affairs of rope and shouting. Some grew into elaborate ceremonies, cloaked in the trappings of legality, echoing the solemnity of actual property transfers. In these cases, the husband and the buyer, or sometimes even the woman herself, drew up formal bills of sale. The language mimicked legal documents with eerie precision, as though copying the structure of legitimacy could conjure it into being. One such record survives. I, John Parsons, for and in consideration of the sum of £6 and 6 shillings in hand paid, do sell, assign, and set over unto John Tooker, Ann Parsons, wife of the said John Parsons, with all right, property, claim, services, and demands whatsoever, during the term of the natural life of her, the said Ann Parsons. In that chilling sentence, a human life was treated with the same language as cattle, land, or tools. These mock legal rituals were not limited to the paperwork. The community often participated in ways that blurred the line between degradation and festivity. After the sale, it was common for all parties, husband, wife, and new partner, to retire to the nearest public house for what was effectively a wedding feast. The drinks flowed, songs were sung, and the humiliation of the marketplace gave way to the strange cheer of celebration. In some towns, church bells were rung to mark the transfer, lending the air of holy matrimony to what was, in truth, a parody of it. In one recorded case from 1827, the bells rang out joyfully as though it were a legitimate wedding. For the community, the sound confirmed that the sale had worked, that it was binding in the only way they understood, by public acknowledgement. The marketplace itself became a stage for entertainment. These events drew crowds, sometimes hundreds strong, who came not only to witness but to revel. In a society with little theater, no cinema, and rare public amusements, a wife sale was spectacle, part court proceeding, part carnival, part morality play. People jeered, cheered, placed side bets on the price, and gossiped about the characters involved long after the halter had changed hands. In this blending of humiliation and festivity, wife selling revealed its double nature. It was at once a grotesque parody of the law and a desperate attempt to imitate it. It was a source of shame for those involved and yet a form of entertainment for those who gathered to watch. It degraded women by reducing them to property, and yet, paradoxically, sometimes elevated them by giving them a way to leave one life and begin another. The ritual was never just about the transaction of money. It was about visibility. It was about being seen, acknowledged, and remembered. And in a world where the law refused to recognize a woman's desire to escape, the marketplace became the only court where her plea could be heard. For every story where a wife stepped into the market square willingly, even defiantly, there were others where consent was murkier, or absent altogether. The ritual, for all its strange dignity, could just as easily collapse into cruelty, drunken impulse, or outright coercion. In Manchester, 1824, one wife was knocked down for 5 shillings, but she recoiled from the man who claimed her, declaring she would not go. The crowd laughed, and the solution was as absurd as it was chilling. She was re-auctioned, offered again like a stubborn mule, and sold a second time, for 3 shillings and a quart of ale. Imagine the terror of standing before jeering strangers while men bartered not just over your body, but over your future, deciding your fate like horse traders haggling over price. In Halifax, 1837, a blacksmith known only as G sold his wife for 1 shilling, then drunkenly bought her back, only to resell her again to a married man for ½ a crown. When the wife learned of this, she stormed into the square, and in a fury of humiliation and betrayal, she mauled her husband rather severely. The record of her rage lingers in dry newspaper ink, a rare glimpse of a woman refusing to submit to this farce. Some sales spiraled into grotesque spectacles of despair. In March 1766, a carpenter in Southwark sold his wife in a fit of drunken indifference at an alehouse. When he sobered the next day and begged her to return, she refused. Unable to bear the humiliation, he hanged himself. In that act of desperation, we see the brutal paradox of wife-selling. It was meant as escape, but it could just as easily destroy those caught in its snare. Children, too, were sometimes swept into these transactions. A woman sold in 1865 came with 2 children, the buyer agreeing to pay not only for her, but £25 each for the little ones, a staggering sum, years of a laborer's wages. Here, the market reduced not only wives but entire families to line items in a grotesque ledger. The prices of wives varied wildly. Some fetched over £100, equivalent to many years of wages. Others were sold for the price of a pint of ale. Yet the money was never the essence. What mattered was the public transfer. The halter passed from one man to another, the crowd's nod of approval that turned farce into fact. Still, these darker cases expose the fragile line wife-selling walked between ritual and abuse. When the woman herself resisted, when she refused to accept the outcome, the crowd often turned restless. A sale without her reluctant assent risked collapse. Neighbors might intervene, or a magistrate might step in. And yet the fear never left her. The fear that she could end up in the hands of a stranger, bound to a fate worse than the one she had left behind. Consent gave wife selling its strange legitimacy, but its absence revealed its brutality. For many women, standing in that square was not liberation, but a gamble with their very lives. Wife selling existed in a strange twilight between legality and custom. It was never formally recognized by English law. Indeed, to most judges and lawyers, it was nothing more than adultery followed by bigamy, if the couple later married. Yet, in village squares and industrial towns, the practice carried a kind of rough legitimacy, one sustained not by statutes, but by the will of communities themselves. Reactions varied wildly. In some towns, the sales were treated almost as festivals. Crowds jeered, laughed, and pressed closer to watch the spectacle. In others, unease simmered beneath the surface, neighbors muttering that such things disgraced the town. Authorities, too, wavered. In Ashbourne, Derbyshire, 1819, a magistrate tried to prevent a sale. He was met with jeers, pelted with refuse, and driven out by the furious crowd. Later, he confessed his uncertainty. "I do not think I have a right to prevent it, because it rests upon a custom preserved by the people, of which perhaps it would be dangerous to deprive them by any law." Even the keepers of the law recognized the peril of interfering with a ritual the poor believed necessary. In some cases, officials did more than tolerate it. They encouraged it. Poor law commissioners, responsible for supporting destitute families in the dreaded workhouses, sometimes pressured men to sell their wives rather than burden the parish with their upkeep. One such case occurred in 1814, when Henry Cook was compelled by the Effingham workhouse authorities to sell his wife instead of applying for parish relief. He took her to Cooden Market, where she was sold for a single shilling, with the parish itself paying for the journey and even footing the bill for a wedding dinner. Bureaucratic cruelty and community custom walked hand in hand. The symbolism of the location mattered deeply. Sales almost always occurred in market squares, the very heart of commercial life, where grain, cattle, and cloth exchanged hands. By choosing these sites, participants made a bold statement. If the law denied them legitimacy, the marketplace would provide it. The presence of neighbors, traders, and farmers lent the ceremony the weight of witness. And then there was the halter, its meaning cut deeper than rope or ribbon. In the eyes of the law, a wife was already property, but the halter made that metaphor visible, undeniable. She was livestock to be led, sold, and transferred. Some accounts even note that women were priced by weight, the ultimate expression of their reduction to commodity. Yet the ritual's strange power lay in its duality. It was both grotesque and solemn, both cruel and practical. Crowds might roar with laughter at the husband's drunken patter, but in the same breath they recognized the transfer as binding. To mock the ceremony was to deny its purpose. To witness it was to give it strength. Thus, wife-selling survived not because it was legal, but because communities colluded in it, sometimes out of sympathy for trapped women, sometimes out of appetite for spectacle, and often out of a belief that custom was more practical than distant law. By the middle of the 19th century, the sight of a woman with a halter around her neck being sold in a marketplace no longer carried the same uneasy acceptance it once had. What had seemed like a rough but tolerable solution to impossible marriages now appeared to many as a disgrace. Newspapers began to change their tone. Where earlier reports often described the sales with wry amusement, mid-Victorian editors increasingly condemned them as disgusting and disgraceful exhibitions. The same events that once drew laughter now provoked outrage, particularly among the rising middle classes. To them, wife-selling symbolized not practicality but barbarism, a mark of working-class degradation. Respectability had become a new currency, and such spectacles were too crude for a society that prized domestic privacy and moral restraint. The pressure of reform was building elsewhere too. In 1857, the Matrimonial Causes Act made divorce possible through the civil courts rather than Parliament. It was still expensive, around £40, more than a laborer's yearly wages, but it represented a glimmer of accessibility. For the first time, the law cracked open the door that had been sealed shut for centuries. Slowly, the desperate need for rough justice in the marketplace began to wane. Religious movements added their voices. Evangelical preachers thundered against the practice from their pulpits, declaring it a sin against God and marriage. The Salvation Army, founded in the 1860s, actively campaigned to suppress such customs, preaching reform even as they offered bread and shelter. Yet irony clings to history. In 1889, a member of the Salvation Army himself sold his wife for a shilling in Hucknall, Nottinghamshire, proof that moral ideals often faltered against the realities of poverty and desperation. By the 1850s and 1860s, wife sales still occurred, but increasingly in private. Couples drew up deeds of transfer quietly, avoiding the jeering spectacle of the market. The ritual had not vanished, but it was retreating into the shadows, no longer tolerated as public entertainment. The last recorded wife sale in England took place in 1913, when a woman in Leeds testified in court that her husband had sold her to a workmate for £1. By then, the practice was a relic, more embarrassing than binding. Legal divorce, while still imperfect, had become more attainable, and the cultural landscape had shifted too far to allow the old ritual to continue in daylight. Wife selling did not die because the law suddenly recognized women as equals. It died because society changed, because new ideas of respectability, morality, and love made the spectacle intolerable. What had once been justified as custom now looked like savagery, and when the crowd turned away, the halters fell silent. It is tempting to view wife selling purely as barbarism, a crude spectacle of men disposing of unwanted wives, and in many ways it was. Yet the deeper truth is more complicated and perhaps more unsettling. Within this ritual, some women discovered their only avenue of choice, their only chance to seize a fragment of control. The historical record is dotted with stories of wives who not only consented to the sales, but insisted on them. When husbands faltered or wavered, some women urged them forward. In Plymouth, 1822, one woman even provided money for her own lover to buy her, ensuring the transaction could take place. In other cases, wives openly defied reluctant husbands, declaring in front of the crowd, "I will be sold. I want a change." To modern ears, these words sound tragic, even absurd. Yet, in their time, they were acts of agency. The law denied women the right to file for divorce. Courts denied them the right to keep their wages, their inheritance, even the clothes on their backs. But, in the theater of the marketplace, with neighbors as witnesses, they could demand a transfer. Crude, humiliating, degrading, yes, but also a weapon, however blunt, against the total erasure of their personhood. It is here that wife-selling's paradox sharpens. It degraded women, comparing them to livestock, stripping them of dignity in the most public way. And yet, it could also liberate them, moving them from violence, poverty, or neglect into a new life with a man of their choosing. Some women arranged their own sales with lovers, turning a grotesque parody into an act of survival, even of hope. Agency, however, was fragile. A woman could demand to be sold, but she could not control the bidding once it began. She could hope for her lover to outbid all others, but she stood vulnerable in the eyes of strangers who might see her not as a partner, but as a servant to be used. For every story of a woman seizing freedom, there was another of one betrayed, coerced, or trapped anew. This duality is what makes wife selling so haunting. It was both oppression and resistance, cruelty and survival. It mocked women by reducing them to property, and yet gave them a thin, bitter slice of the freedom that law denied. Behind each sale was not just a spectacle but a story, of abuse endured, of hunger faced, of secret lovers waiting, of women willing to risk humiliation before the crowd for the hope of something better. Their choices were not free in the way we understand freedom. They were the choices of the trapped, the desperate, the cornered, yet they were choices nonetheless. And in those choices lies a reminder. Even within systems designed to erase them, women carved out slivers of power, fragments of voice. Wife-selling was barbarism, yes, but it was also, in its twisted way, survival. To understand why wife-selling persisted for nearly 2 centuries, we must look beyond the marketplace and into the world of the poor who practiced it. Life in 19th century England was brutal for the working classes. A man might earn 10 shillings a week, barely enough to keep a family clothed and fed. Families often crowded into single rooms with no sanitation. Children as young as 6 spent 12 hours in factories or mines, their lungs filling with soot before they had even learned to read. Marriage, for the wealthy, might be about love, property, or alliances. For the poor, it was about survival. A wife's unpaid labor, washing, cooking, nursing children, was essential to the household economy. A husband's wages, however meager, provided the base upon which everything else balanced. When that balance tipped, when a man drank away his pay, when he refused to work, when violence made home unbearable, there was no safety net to catch the family. The church offered moral advice but no remedy. The law punished disorder but gave no relief. In such a vacuum, communities improvised their own solutions. Wife selling was one of them. It was not simply a grotesque spectacle, but part of what historians call rough justice, a system in which the poor enforced their own sense of fairness, outside the reach of formal courts. This is why the crowd mattered so much. The community was not just an audience, it was a jury. Their presence turned a private scandal into a public resolution. If they witnessed the sale, they could later affirm it had happened, ensuring that gossip would not ruin the new couple and that the old husband would not return with claims of abandonment. The community's nod was the closest thing to legality the poor could afford. And yet, the way these events were reported reveals a sharp class divide. Newspapers, written largely for middle-class readers, dripped with condescension. They described the sellers and buyers as brutish, the wives as degraded, the crowds as savage and voyeuristic. To the middle classes, wife-selling was proof of the barbarism of the poor, a spectacle confirming their own superiority. But between those lines of mockery, another story emerges, one of desperate people making impossible choices with the tools available to them. A wife with no legal existence, a husband too poor to seek lawful divorce, a community caught between laughter and sympathy. Together, they staged rituals that were at once degrading and necessary. For the poor, the sale was not comedy nor cruelty alone. It was survival. Though wife-selling is remembered as an English oddity, the practice did not remain confined within the borders of England. Like so many customs carried abroad by settlers, it crossed oceans and adapted to new soils. In colonial America, scattered court records reveal cases of wives being sold in markets from Connecticut to South Carolina. These sales often bore a sharper commercial edge, with formal bills of sale and advertisements mimicking the livestock trade even more directly than in England. What was born in desperation on one side of the Atlantic was transformed into contract and commerce on the other. Abroad, the practice fascinated and horrified in equal measure. French newspapers reported eagerly on English wife sales, portraying them as proof of Britain's supposed barbarism. Caricatures showed John Bull, the personification of England, dragging his wife through a market with a rope around her neck. To the French, it was delicious satire. The self-proclaimed leader of European civilization revealed as a nation of wife traders. These exaggerations embarrassed British elites who were already attempting to present their empire as a beacon of morality and progress. Yet, even within England, the image of wife selling seeped into cultural life long after the ritual itself began to fade. Music halls of the mid-19th century turned the practice into comedy. Songs like "The Sale of a Wife" mocked husbands as fools, wives as shrews, and buyers as dupes. For middle-class audiences, laughing at wife-selling meant distancing themselves from it, sanitizing the desperation of the poor into harmless farce. But behind the jokes lingered a shadow, the uneasy knowledge that this was no mere legend, but something their grandparents had likely witnessed. Popular literature, too, mined the theme. Thomas Hardy famously wove the motif into The Mayor of Casterbridge, where a man drunkenly sells his wife and child to a sailor. Hardy, himself steeped in rural traditions, knew how such rituals haunted memory. The tale worked because readers recognized its plausibility. They knew such things had happened, and might yet happen again. Alcohol itself was often the silent partner in these rituals. Taverns were natural settings for sales, the air thick with pipe smoke and ale-fueled bravado. Men made reckless bargains after drink, their wives humiliated in front of neighbors. The ritual frequently ended with all parties raising glasses together, a mock celebration that blurred the line between degradation and camaraderie. If the sale was brutal, alcohol softened its edges, or at least numbed the participants enough to bear it. But the echoes of wife selling reached deeper than songs or stories. They revealed cultural anxieties about marriage, property, and gender roles that persisted even after the last halters fell away. Who owned whom within marriage? Was a wife partner, servant, or possession? What happened when economic survival clashed with moral law? These questions did not vanish with the ritual. They only shifted into new forms, into novels, gossip, sermons, and debates about reform. Even as wife selling retreated into history, its shadow lingered, a reminder of a time when the marketplace stood in for the courtroom, and when communities crafted their own brutal answers to questions the law refused to ask. By the late 19th century, wife selling was fading into memory. Its decline was not sudden, nor was it caused by a sudden wave of enlightenment. Instead, it eroded slowly, chipped away by changes in law, society, and culture. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 marked turning points. For the first time, wives could legally keep their earnings and inherit property in their own right. It was a small but vital recognition that women were not merely shadows of their husbands. Divorce, too, became more accessible through the civil courts, though still costly and socially stigmatized. These reforms did not erase centuries of inequality, but they loosened the iron grip of coverture, piece by piece. Yet the true horror of wife selling was never simply the spectacle of halters and auctions. It was what the ritual revealed about the society that made it necessary. When law denies justice, people invent their own forms of justice, however crude, however grotesque. A woman with a rope around her neck in a market square was not only a victim of her husband's cruelty, she was a victim of a legal system that erased her existence. Some found freedom in the ritual, even happiness. A few women entered new partnerships built on respect and affection, however unlikely. Others discovered that changing masters changed little, trading one form of cruelty for another. All of them paid a price, in dignity, in reputation, in the scars left by being treated as livestock. The last recorded sale, in Leeds in 1913, was already an anachronism, mocked rather than validated. But the deeper questions it raised did not vanish. They echo forward. What happens when legal systems fail the most vulnerable? When courts are inaccessible, or laws are blind to suffering, how do desperate people carve out survival? Wife selling reminds us that progress is not inevitable. Rights we take for granted, divorce, property ownership, legal personhood, were bought with centuries of suffering. The market squares where women once stood with halters have long been repaved, now lined with shops and cafes. But beneath the stone lies the memory of those desperate transactions, the murmur of crowds bearing witness, the voices of women demanding change in the only language their world would hear. They deserve to be remembered not only as victims of a cruel custom, but as survivors who seized scraps of agency from a system designed to crush them. Their choices were painful, humiliating, often degrading. But they were choices nonetheless, made with courage in the face of impossible odds. And so, the story of wife selling leaves us with both warning and hope. Warning that progress can stall or even reverse, that rights are fragile and must be defended. Hope that even in the darkest corners of history, people found ways, however imperfect, to seek freedom, dignity, and the chance of a better life. The halters are gone, the market silent, but the questions they raise remain urgent. How do we ensure justice reaches everyone, not just the privileged few? How do we build systems that recognize humanity before property, survival before custom? To remember those women, standing in frost and mud, their futures balanced on the bids of strangers, is to honor their struggle and to remind ourselves that freedom, dignity, and justice are never given. They are won, and they must be protected, always.